Hi everyone, my name is Sophia and I'm here with my collaborators Dana and Nathan. And today we're going to be presenting on adaptive experimentation to improve and increase happiness and well-being. So we are a collaboration between the Intelligent Adaptive Interventions Lab and the Population Well-being Lab. And just a little roadmap for today. We are going to, that way, perfect. A little roadmap for what we're going to be talking to you about today is first we're going to be talking about adaptive experimentation and what it is. How can we go from traditional experimentation where we have random assignment to intentional assignment and how this could kind of address some of the limitations that exist in traditional experimentation like cost, timeliness, and willpower. We're going to go into our own well-being study and we're going to go into a demo about how this is going to work. It's going to be based, a little snippet of it is email-based social behavioral activation, sneak peek. And finally, we're going to introduce experiments as a service infrastructure, and so how we're going to facilitate adaptive experimentation on a large scale. And we'd also like to mention that this project is being funded by the DSI seed funding for methodologists, and so yeah, we're really excited to be presenting to you this project today. And I'll pass this off to Dana.
Perfect. So first a little bit about adaptive experiments. The guiding question we usually use is how can we perpetually enhance the design of an intervention using AI to do adaptive micro-experiments to test many different versions. So adaptive A/B testing is just a version of A/B testing where the sample group is dynamically adjusted as the experiment goes on and we're getting data. So instead of just keeping participants at 50-50 random uniform random assignment, as we're getting rewards, we're actually adjusting the sample group towards the intervention that seems to be working best on average. So reward in machine learning is kind of what outcome measure or dependent variable is to psychologists, but in psychology where we can use a bit more distal measures, in adaptive experimentation we really rely on proximal measures, so immediate outcomes like button clicks, whether they click a link, whether they click on a rating scale, and then as the experiment goes on, we start to collect that and adjust to give more people the better condition faster. So one advantage of adaptive experimentation is this personalization component. So we're personalizing interventions for each user rather than just on average. An example is prompts to encourage COVID vaccination. Here you can see some examples of messages that are based on psychological principles. And what happens is each message is crafted to appeal to a certain demographic based on their context. And as the experiment goes on, we can kind of see responses. So when we can see when they open the message, we see when they've clicked a link we've embedded to either share on social media or go book your vaccine appointment. And then we can start to reallocate messages for participants based on their context, based on which ones they seem to be responding to more. Another nice aspect of personalization, in traditional experiments, usually you detect which intervention works better on average, but what works best for the majority may not be what's best for a minority within that group. And oftentimes what happens is you start to omit conditions where the majority is benefiting, but maybe a minority is not, or even being harmed by the intervention. You also omit conditions where it doesn't work better on average, but maybe the intervention works for a subgroup of the population. So interaction effects like that. Here's an example of an intervention that's getting people to go get some exercise, and one of them is saying go on a walk around the block. Now depending on the participant's context, like their socioeconomic status or the location of their neighborhood, that may not be the best intervention for them. In fact, it might harm them, it might put them in danger, so maybe something like simple exercises to do at home might be more beneficial for them. And this is just examples of contextual variables we can take into account. And here's an example of an intervention we're currently running at our lab. So this project looks a lot of contextual variables. Basically, Mental Health America is an automated text messaging service to improve users' mental health and well-being. This is in collaboration with Northwestern University and Mental Health America, which is a nonprofit. And basically the goal is to send people, they're signed up to an 8-week program that sends them text messages, and we vary components of the message. So based on what kind of psychological intervention they're receiving, whether we give them rationale, give them a link, or the interaction style we have them perform, we're trying to see which components or sequences are going to improve their mental health and well-being over the long term, and we're trying to adapt for that.
So another example where we're deploying adaptive experiments is in partnership with the Open Learning Initiative, where we're competing at the X Prize $1 million competition. Here we're building A/B testing tools and integrating them with digital learning platforms so we can do things like try out different types of explanations for like math problems and stuff like that. We're also building in contextual variables to see, if low prior knowledge, if explanations will work better for them, and versus high prior knowledge, things like that.
All right, so how does population well-being come into this picture? Well, I mean, something that the Population Well-Being Lab tries to do is we're trying to find determinants of variables that improve or increase well-being. And so according to one definition of well-being by the American Psychological Association, well-being is a state of contentment. So overall good physical, mental health, and a positive outlook on life. So I mean, this sounds very nice, but how do we actually get it done? How do we get people to feel more well-being in their daily lives? And according to one longitudinal study, this has been running from 1938, this is the Harvard longitudinal study, very famous, they found that the single best predictor of well-being is the quality of one's social bonds. And so what we wanted to do, given this knowledge that social bonds and relationships are truly, one of the best predictors of well-being, something that can, puts a pep in your step, we wanted to design a study that tests out different types of social behavior activation interventions. And so we are going to crowdsource from psychologists ideas for these social activation behaviors. And we're going to ask them to design a text message, a short message that encourages someone to start a short social behavior. So the main kind of variables that we're trying to get psychologists to come up with, the main manipulations in these type of text messages are the actual type of intervention. So whether that's calling a friend or joining a Facebook group, that's the first kind of main independent variable that we're interested in testing, and which one of these interventions is better serving, is better able to increase one's well-being. And the second independent variable is the type of kind of motivational message that's embedded into that text message, which is going to get that person up and moving and essentially doing this social activity. And so they can allude to kind of extrinsic motivation or intrinsic motivation. Like one example of a text message could be like, reconnecting with friends can make them feel like they're important to you. Reach out to a friend you haven't spoken to in a long time and catch up with them. And then what we're going to be testing once we deploy this intervention is the main two dependent variables that we're going to be checking is whether that message actually succeeded in getting that person to participate in this activity. And the second thing is how much did it even increase their happiness by any significant margin? And by how much did it achieve to do this? And so this kind of, from first glance, this looks like a traditional experiment, but we're very much interested in turning this into an adaptive experiment. And that's what we're going to be demonstrating next.
All right, so at the Intelligent Adaptive Interventions Lab, we take a three-pillared approach, interdisciplinary approach to designing these adaptive interventions. So what you just saw was our paradigm, which comes from our friends in psychology. This is what we're actually looking to alter here. And so next, we're going to be talking about how do we embed that paradigm within some sort of interface. And that's where the human-computer interaction component happens. And then we'll also look at what kinds of policies for assignment we use and how we gather reward. So let's make this concrete by looking at one example. So let's say we've got this extrinsic condition, right? We've embedded it within an email, and now we're taking a look. We've placed here our extrinsic motivator. Reconnecting with friends can make them feel like they're important to you. Condition 2, or R&B, we're using the intrinsic motivation. So here we're saying reconnecting with friends can make you feel like a part of something bigger than yourself. But there's a couple of implicit design choices and factors that we need to consider when the paradigm is embedded within some sort of digital interface. So here with an email, we have things like subject line, where we have to be considerate about our verbiage, right? Are we taking a friendly tone? Are we taking a formal approach? We also have things like salutation and sign-off. What do we do with those? How do we make them align with the paradigm in some way? And then also, where do we put our factors, right? Is it in the body of the email? Do we find a way to embed it in the subject line? And these all change when we're using different forms of digital interface. If it's a text, if it's an application of some sort, all of these factors change. And so HCI contributes a couple of larger scale guiding questions, like how do we design an interface to express this paradigm in some way? Do we use images, videos, text? What kinds of applications? We also ask, what elements of the design can we vary? In this email example, we have subject line, salutation, and sign-off, maybe the ordering of factors within the body of the email. But again, in text or some other application, it could be completely different. We also, of course, have to ask, how do we design an interface to receive an immediate outcome measure in some way? And so that brings us nicely to our ML and stats component, right? We need to consider reward. So we might be asking, how do we interpret reward these immediate outcome measures? And what assignment policies align with the intervention and the population we're working with? What contextual factors do we need to think of so that we're taking into account the possible subpopulations within that group? So, for example, one outcome measure we can use is email open rate. And so HCI gives us this question, how do we get it from the interface? Well, luckily emails sort of auto-report whether they've been opened. Then we have to ask, what do these data look like? Well, in this case, it's a binary variable, right? Either they opened it or they didn't. So we have 1 as a positive value, 0 as a negative value. From psych, we have to ask, is this a good proximal outcome measure? And this might be a good proximal outcome measure of engagement, but maybe not so much well-being itself. And then lastly, we ask, how consistent are these data? In this case, when every single email goes out, we get some data point, right? We either get the open or they didn't. But that's not always the case. So, looking at a different possible reward. Let's say we ask users to score it from 1 to 5. Well, in this case, we have to ask, how do we get that from the interface? Well, we could send users a link to a form, and they have to click that, and they enter some values. Or we could ask them to reply with their own email with just a score of 1 to 5. There's design trade-offs on either side of those. We also ask, what do these data look like? So now we've got a score from 1 to 5, and we have to ask, well, how much more positive is a 5 than a 4? Or how much less positive is a 1 than a 2? That changes the way we adapt the algorithm. Is a 3 perfectly neutral? We have to make those decisions. Again, we're asking, is this a good proximal outcome measure? So we're getting sort of a change in instantaneous well-being. Is that a good measure of long-term well-being? We're going to have to do the literature review for that. And then we ask, how consistent are these data points? And this is one of the big problems with getting users to self-report like this. We're relying on them to provide us some sort of feedback. And there's no guarantee they will. So again, we have to ask, what do these data look like? Is a no response just a 0? Is that extremely negative, or is that neutral? These are design choices we have to consider. And so we just went through this very interdisciplinary, expertise-written design process. But designing these interventions should be easy. So here we're building the experiments as a service infrastructure, where we're building software infrastructure to make it easy for psychologists, educators, and stuff like that to build interventions this way into digital learning platforms and what other digital interfaces they want. So thank you.
Yeah, and one more thing, thank you so much for listening to our presentation. This is our kind of expedited timeline of what we're planning to accomplish over the next year. So phase 1 is going to be actually asking crowdsourcing psychologists to come up with these kind of interventions and working with them to deploy them, and we're going to be in a great shape to apply for the Catalyst grant come spring. Phase 2, phase 3, phase 4 is actually going to be us deploying these interventions and collecting the data. And finally, phase 5, which is going to be in the fall, we're going to be presenting the results of our study at the EASY conference in hopefully November. And thank you so much, and we are really excited to hear your feedback and questions.